10 days before Donald Trump assumes office for the second time and will dramatically change the trajectory of the United States support for Ukraine and where that war is going as compared to the outgoing administration. And we're going to have some sound bites for you today, some commentary that we've seen from some supporters of the current administration and then some officials from the administration itself as they give warnings on the way out the door. And some of the things that they claim as successes in their production, it's going to be a bit of a head scratcher if you're being very polite, but there are other words I could use that are not so polite, but more accurate. And to try and help us unpack some of this stuff, especially in diplomatic affairs, there is nobody better than Ambassador Chaz Freeman. We were very grateful to have you back on here today. Mr. Ambassador, welcome back to the show.
Glad to be here with you.
Well, listen, as we were talking a little bit before we went on air here, this is going to be a bit of a difficult one to stomach, but we know you're up for the challenge here. I want to look at, first of all, about some of the things that have been going on lately. There was just the last Ramstein meeting that has been held since the war started. I believe it was the 24th. And some of the things that are coming out of it kind of show you what people really think, whatever words they use. When you look at their actions, it, I think, tells a little bit bigger of a story. Germany has made some news because they gave another 30 tanks, 30 armored personnel carriers, claimed that in the year of 2025, they were going to train 10,000 Ukraine troops. That's, for those who may not know, that's a really small number if to try to claim in a whole year. 30 tanks is basically 2 companies worth of armor. Both of those together would be basically 2 mechanized companies worth of armor, a drop in the bucket, and a handful of missiles for Irish-T. Meanwhile, the British Foreign Secretary Lemmy has suggested that, well, the war might not be over with on the 21st of January after Trump comes in, but he thinks probably no later than Easter. So you see that people are already reading the tea leaves here, and yet we have the Atlantic is warning that we cannot abandon Ukraine. If Trump comes in and abandons Ukraine, all kinds of bad things are going to happen. In fact, it can plunge the entire world into an era of instability. Wow, those are pretty strong words. First of all, just kind of want your 30,000 foot level view of what it's going to mean when Trump comes in for both the Ukraine war and apparently civilization.
Well, this is quite an apocalyptic headline, to be sure. I'd note that Ukraine has just upped its recruitment goal to 40,000 a month, which illustrates your point that 10,000 is nothing. They're apparently losing around that number every month. In fact, the latest casualty figures that I've seen suggest that there may have been as many as 920,000 Ukrainians killed, with maybe 650,000 draft dodgers fleeing the country. This is a country that's in its last throes, and it is being thrown little bits and pieces of weaponry by its NATO backers. Really, this is not going to help. And what they're doing is showing an awareness that it's about over. You can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool all of the people all of the time, we are told. And we've come to the point where the mainstream media's entirely fallacious, fictitious story about what's been happening in Ukraine and what's at stake there is unraveling. The thesis of the piece in the Atlantic, I believe, is that there's some kind of inspiration of autocrats who are inherently aggressive and want to take over the world that would emerge if we somehow recognize that Ukraine has been defeated, which we have to do if we want to end this war. And I don't know what Mr. Trump is going to do, because he seemed to have been led to believe earlier that the objective should be a ceasefire. But the Russians have been very clear from the very beginning they are not going to accept a ceasefire. They want a peace. And that peace has to include 3 elements. One is neutrality for Ukraine, whatever remains of Ukraine. They will keep the areas of Ukraine, the Russian-speaking areas, that they felt obliged to protect. They will keep those as part of Russia. And finally, They want to have a general discussion with Europeans and the United States about a security architecture for Europe that removes the obvious threat to them of NATO on their border, but also removes the threat that Europeans feel from Russia. They're willing to bargain and compromise. So I don't know what's going to happen. General Kellogg, who was appointed as special envoy by Mr. Trump, seems to have come into that role with the idea that somehow he could escalate to de-escalate. In other words, do more of the same at a higher level, and that would somehow produce a Russian capitulation. That's not going to happen. Absolutely not going to happen. So I don't think we know. Here's this mooted meeting between Trump and Putin. I don't think we can predict what will come out of that. But
yeah, I mean, I think everything's going to come down to what each side is willing to do to reach an end. And the biggest problem, which you just highlighted by the paucity of things that even are still being offered by the West, but much more so the manpower is simply not present. It doesn't even matter if we said, you know what, forget about any strategic reserves of our own militarily. We're going to give you guys everything. We're going to give you 2 division sets worth of all of our best stuff and all the ammunition you can use. They couldn't use it. It wouldn't change anything on the battlefield. And that's a reality that too few people recognize.
But here, Danny, is the key point. You cannot reverse at the negotiating table what has happened on the battlefield. The battlefield determines the parameters of what is possible. And the Russians have won. They are on the verge of routing the Ukrainians, who have run out of manpower. And we're going to have to stop pretending that everything has been going wonderful for the Ukrainians and that they have clobbered the Russians terribly and that they're firing long-range missiles or drones into Russia somehow is going to change the contours of the battlefield in Ukraine. It won't. So the basic thing Mr. Trump can contribute is a realistic sense of what has happened and what is therefore possible. The outgoing administration has not been at all realistic.
Well, and to highlight your point, here is Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin at that Ramstein meeting, giving his view of reality.
If Putin swallows Ukraine, his appetite will only grow. If tyrants learn that aggression pays, we will only invite even more aggression, chaos, and war. But we are still determined to not let that happen. Retreat will only provide incentives for more imperial aggression. And if we flinch, you can count on Putin to push further and punch harder. Ukraine's survival is on the line. But so is the security of Europe, the United States, and the world.
Apparently he read the Atlantic piece there, because apparently the whole world is at stake if Russia wins in Ukraine. But as you pointed out, they already have. But so what do you make about that? Especially his claim that if we retreat, I mean, you can't retreat when you're being driven off the field. I don't know how that works.
Well, this is an ideological statement. It is a priori reasoning. It is dogmatic. It is the assertion of a principle that if you retreat, the other side will come after you. That is not the real world. That is a theory. And I note that we have, to some extent, I suppose, been the primary authors of this theory because we keep invading other countries and nobody stops us. And we support Israel invading all its neighbors and committing genocide while it does it. We don't seem to draw the lesson with regard to ourselves. Basically, what Secretary Austin is saying, without perhaps even understanding that he's doing so, is that we've come to the point where no military solution is possible that would benefit us. We need to have a diplomatic solution. And that is what everybody is, except the outgoing Biden administration and the Zelensky regime, and not unconstitutionally in power now in Kyiv, it has realized.
Yeah, that's okay. So that's bad. what Austin said there, for all the reasons you mentioned here. It gets a little more difficult when we move from Secretary of Defense to Secretary of State. Now, I'm going to show you a couple of sound bites from Anthony Blinken in his so-called exit interview, one of the last ones he will have done as Secretary of State. And in the first one, he talks about what the conditions are right now as he sees it as they hand off to Trump. And then the second one is going to be, he's going to talk about all the diplomacy he tried to do early. I want to take these in separate bites here because each one deserves its own. So let's first of all see how strong Ukraine is because of what this administration has done.
Right now, where as I'm looking at this, I think the real measure of success is whether going forward, Ukraine will continue to stand strong as an independent country, increasingly integrated with Western institutions, and able to stand on its own feet militarily, economically, democratically. And in each of those areas, we put Ukraine on a trajectory to do that.
Do you think it's time to end the war, though?
These are decisions for Ukrainians to make.
Yeah. Are they really able to stand increasingly strongly on economic, military, and diplomatic
grounds? This is part of a cacophony of lies as the Biden administration goes out, trying to develop a legacy for itself, which it doesn't deserve and didn't create. Basically, we maneuvered Ukraine into destroying itself. And if we don't stop this war and do it on a reasonable basis pretty soon, Ukraine is going to be a very small rump state with no coastline on the Black Sea. So you look at Ukraine, it started out at independence with 52 million people. At the time this war began, it probably had 33 million people. It's got less than 20 million now. People have fled the country, both to Russia and to Europe, Western Europe, Poland, other neighbors. People have fled the draft. The desertion rate on the battlefield now is very high by the Ukrainians. This is a country which needs a diplomatic solution to survive. Mr. Blinken did absolutely nothing during his term in office to advance that cause. He exemplified to me the reality that there is nobody so bloodthirsty as a civilian urging the military to do things that he doesn't understand and which are frankly impossible.
Now if that's all we talk about, that's a really pretty substantial condemnation of the performance of the so-called Secretary of State, as opposed to the Secretary of War, which I think he's probably been more closely akin to since he's been in office during this war, especially. Well, I mean, we could also go into the Middle East, but we'll hold that for another day here. But this last one here, I got to say, is the most egregious to me because either, and you tell me what you think after watching this, either Secretary Blinken is a pathological liar and he knows what he's talking about, he knows what he's saying and he's intentionally trying to deceive, or he's delusional and he actually believes this. I don't know which it is, but I can tell you authoritatively, nothing he's about to say is true.
Look, I worked very hard in the lead up to the war, including meetings with my Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, in Geneva a couple of months before the war, trying to find a way to see if we could prevent it, trying to test the proposition, whether this was really about Russia's concerns for its security, concerns somehow about Ukraine and the threat that it posed, or NATO and the threat that it posed, or whether this was about what it in fact is about, which is Putin's imperial ambitions and the desire to recreate a greater Russia, to subsume Ukraine back into Russia. But we had to test that proposition, and we were intensely engaged diplomatically with Russia. Since then, had there been any opportunity to engage diplomatically in a way that could end the war on just and durable terms, we would have been the first to seize them. Unfortunately, at least till this moment, we haven't seen any signs that Russia's been genuinely prepared to engage. I hope that changes.
I mean, where do you even start to unpack that? I mean, let's just start go ahead.
Let me remind everybody that this war began when Antony Blinken and Joe Biden, our president, refused to negotiate with Russia. refused to talk to Russia. This is the Secretary of State who has not visited Moscow once in his 4 years in office. He has ricocheted off his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, on the margins of various international conferences. This business of his trying very hard to avoid war does not jibe with the facts. So I think this does raise the question whether he is simply lying or whether he actually believes the nonsense he spouts. But in any event, it is not anything, what he's just said is not anything that withstands scrutiny or will rehabilitate his reputation in time.
Well, let's look at some of the things that he said specifically. One of the first things off the top is he said he had to test the proposition. So he said that this was not about NATO expansion up to the border, which Putin said, and everyone in Russia said, I don't know, since 2008 especially, that it was all about imperial ambitions. And somehow he concluded through diplomacy that it was about imperial ambition to try and absorb Ukraine into Russia. Any comments on that?
The Russians have never announced a decision or a desire to absorb Ukraine, and they would be crazy to do so. Western Ukraine, which was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, is pathologically anti-Russian. They joined the Germans in World War II against the Soviet Union. That is of great concern to the Russians. It is not, the Russians were not expanding into Ukraine. We were expanding into Ukraine, NATO, the United States. And every country that has joined NATO has seen American troops and equipment arrive on its soil. So the concern the Russians has been entirely realistic. We reacted drastically when the Russians, as the Soviet Union, put missiles in Cuba on our doorstep. We reacted forcefully when during our Civil War, the French installed a puppet emperor in Mexico. First thing we did after that war, our Civil War ended, was to threaten the French with an invasion. They had the good sense to leave. This is a lot of malarkey, and I don't see any diplomacy in it at all. So he was trying to test the proposition, which basically had no evidence behind it at all, and he was not listening to the other side, and he refused to talk to the other side about its concerns. He dismissed them out of hand as poppycock, and this is diplomacy? I'm sorry.
Yeah, and of course we had two big ones. I guess from the time that Ukraine and Zelensky first signed that law that they were going to reacquire all the lost territories in March of 2021, March 11th, I believe, where they said they're going to take them all back. And then Russia started building up its forces to that. Putin at that time was saying, apply the Minsk agreements. Let's employ those. So he's trying to use negotiations as opposed to, or diplomacy rather, as opposed to going to war. And then we know that December 22nd of 2021, Putin gave what we call an ultimatum, but he again said basically a version of Minsk agreements, or there's going to be conflict. He expressly said that was going to be the case. So he tried to. Now, what was the U.S. doing during this time? Blinken also admitted that.
So first, if you look at the trajectory of the conflict, because we saw it coming, we were able to make sure that not only were we prepared and allies and partners were prepared, but that the Ukraine was prepared. We made sure that well before the Russian aggression happened, starting in September, the Russian aggression happened in February, starting in September and then again in December, we quietly got a lot of weapons to Ukraine to make sure that they had in hand what they needed to defend themselves. Things like stingers, javelins that they could use that were instrumental in preventing Russia from taking Kyiv, from rolling over the country, erasing it from the map, and indeed pushing the Russians back.
And in fact, I'll just double down on that, because you also had the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg at the time admit that in the fall of 2021, even before Putin made that December ultimatum, that Putin privately said through diplomatic means that if you'll take NATO off the table, then we're not going to do anything. We're not going to have war. That's a precondition for us to not have war. And he ridiculed that and said, we're not going to do it. So everywhere you look, we did everything to make sure that war came.
The Russian warnings began not in 2008, when we basically strong-armed our NATO partners into inviting Ukraine to join NATO. They began in 1994 with Boris Yeltsin, the predecessor to Vladimir Putin, and they were consistent. And I think it's very clear that on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in fact, the Ukrainian army, which was about 780,000 men strong and had been totally retrained over the preceding 8 years by NATO and the United States, and as Mr. Blinken admitted, armed to the teeth by the United States, was on the verge of launching an offensive to take back the Russian-speaking areas that had rebelled against it. So there's a lot of background here that conveniently gets omitted from this narrative, which is going to be totally disproven and disgraced by historians.
And one of the last things I want to talk about from that previous clip there that he said that I see no signs at all that the Russians have any intention to negotiate an end to this. I guess he missed this clip from December 19th by Vladimir Putin.
We don't have any preconditions for talks. We are ready to engage in a conversation without preconditions. But there has to be a basis of something that we've agreed upon during the talks in Istanbul in late 2022, and based, of course, on the realities on the ground at this moment.
Now, as a diplomat, that's why we're glad to have you on the show. Would you call that an opening, or would you call that a strong arm and not willing to have a negotiated settlement?
No, it was very definitely an opening, and it's been consistent with the Russian position from the beginning. Not only did they propose negotiations in the fall of 2021 and in December of 2021, but they actually went to a negotiation in Istanbul, which he mentioned, and they reached an agreement with the Ukrainians with the help of the Turks and the then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett. We, with the British, then put the kibosh on that agreement. The Russians have been consistent in expressing a willingness to sit down without preconditions. Of course, they have their terms that they will insist upon, and not least because if Ukraine has lost 920,000 men, they have also lost a lot of men too. And they have spent a huge amount of blood and treasure to defend themselves. So I think this Washington Post article that Gary has put up is very relevant. We are the ones who are pursuing a militarized foreign policy. And nothing that Blinken said had any element of diplomacy in it. It was, we're going to arm them, we're going to deter them, we're going to intervene. It was not, we're going to sit down and talk. He said, I don't think they're ready to talk, but they kept saying they wanted to talk. I mean, this is almost criminal.
Yeah, it might even be. So it certainly has been, because it has caused a war that could easily have been avoided, was fought. And then when it could have easily been ended so many times, we just continued to pour more money. And of course, now then Biden's going out the door with just kind of bringing a dump truck up to Kiev and just kind of piling out everything that they have left, still with no diplomacy in here. Well, of course, now then you have that's their administration's officials themselves trying to paper over all the things they've done and claim that they were just trying hard. Some of their, like in the Atlantic, for example, many of them are saying, Trump can't abandon. So they're basically trying to set up and saying, if this fails, it's going to be because of what Trump does. Now here's what Trump's saying was that he's interested to do and why he's interested in making a deal.
I know that Putin would like to meet. I don't think it's appropriate that I meet until after the 20th, which I hate, because, every day many young people are being killed, soldiers. The land is very flat, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers from each, many hundreds of thousands from each side are dead. And they're laying in fields all over the place. Nobody to even collect. There's landmines all over. It's a disaster. But it's very flat. It's great. It's farmland, and it's very, very flat. And the only thing that stops a bullet is the human body. And the human body is stopping a lot of bullets.
Within the
I hope
first
so.
3 to 6
I hope to have 6 months. No, I would think, I hope long before 6 months. Look, Russia's losing a lot of young people, and so is Ukraine.
So he seems focused on that. This is not winnable. Obviously, J.D. Vance, his vice president nominee, campaigned on it, and he wrote a lot of things in the New York Times and elsewhere early in the last year, even before he was designated as vice presidential candidate, that he said the math just doesn't work. We need a negotiated settlement back then. So by all rights, that's what they're going to do. Now, here's the big question I have. Diplomatically, what kind of hand does Trump have to get anything done?
Not a good one, because he has exactly the situation that you mentioned. The outgoing administration is trying to set him up for failure or a charge of appeasement if he does a deal with Putin that is at all realistic. The authorities in Kyiv continue to be adamant. They've basically been led down the garden path and now know that they're not going to last very long. So they're very desperate, but they're holding on to their position because they have nowhere else to go. But in the meantime, the Russians are grinding up the Ukrainians on the battlefield, both in the Kursk salient and along the long battle lines which extend from the northern part of eastern Ukraine right down to the southern part of Ukraine. So Russia's taking strategic places. The Ukrainian army is crumbling. The desertion rate, as I mentioned, is way up. This is a hand that is in decline. It is not. We're not strengthening ourselves by hanging on there. We are weakening the Ukrainian ability to survive as an independent country. And by the way, there's a lot of nonsense about this being democracy versus autocracy or whatever. Ukraine doesn't have a democracy. It suspended its elections. Its president is in office through martial law. It's closed all its independent press. It has broken with the Russian Orthodox Church and insisted on establishing its own religious establishment. This is a very authoritarian country, and it is not a democracy. And this is one of the reasons that getting it into the European Union, which is an obvious thing to do, is going to take decades probably, because it has to cure corruption. Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe. It was that before the war, and it's even worse now. It's not a democracy. It doesn't have a functioning economy. It's totally dependent on handouts from the U.S. taxpayer and Europeans to manage, keep its government in business. So time is not on Ukraine's side. And I think Mr. Trump, to his credit, clearly recognizes that.
And let me ask you, Mr. Ambassador, what do you think the people in Europe, and I'm talking about the leadership, are thinking when they see these things? Because, I mean, you can get, platitudes said all day long. You can get sound bites that, read from the talking points, et cetera. But behind the scenes, I mean, they've got to know, they've got to see how much gas has improved. Natural gas has increased rather the cost because of all the sanctions we put on Russia. They've got to see that all this ammunition, weapons, everything that everybody gave from their own stockpile has just literally gone into a black hole, hasn't changed anything on the battlefield. And why would they want to keep going with the fiction like that? Because it pleases the United States.
Well, that's an interesting question because, of course, they're very concerned about President-elect Trump's position on NATO and Europe and American backing of European defense. And he has not allayed those concerns in any way. So they're playing, they're being basically pretty sycophantic in terms of their relationship with Washington. But, you know, here I have to say that we cannot overlook the fact that in addition to posing with a stiff upper lip for political gain, European leaders have colluded in the world's most intense information warfare. You cannot in Europe, they are totally behind an iron curtain, except this time the iron curtain is keeping all information adverse to their policies out of the Russian press and statements are not carried in Europe anymore. They're in fact quite difficult to get here. And so one of the major casualties of this war has been freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry. Political correctness has smashed anyone who questions the official narrative. And I think a great number of the people around in the government are basically bereft of solid information. They are prisoners of their own propaganda. And
Wow, I hadn't thought of that.
for them, it's all coming crashing down at the moment.
Now, I want to look at one other thing on from Ukraine itself. Now, from one perspective, you can say, okay, Ukraine was invaded. They were there. A lot of their people have been killed, as you pointed out, higher numbers than we admit in the West. And so emotionally, you can understand why Zelensky would want to cling to any kind of hope he could get. But then there does come a point to where you can see clinging to hope is going to get you killed and is going to get you even more losses. I think we passed that point a lot, but here's where Zelensky still is.
Listen, we need to be in a strong position and not talk, but end the war. Yes, it is possible through dialogue. We're not opposed to it. You just need to be in a strong position to make the other person want it. Do you think he wants to end the war? That's what you suggested? I think this is naive. I'm sorry. With all due respect, it's naive to think he wants to finish the war.
So you see Zelensky, and of course, that's from the Lex Fridman interview, which was about 3 hours and covered a lot of topics there. And many times Lex tried to get him to say, yeah, I get your position, but to have a negotiated settlement, which you say you want, you have to sit down and talk with Putin, and you're going to have to make some concessions. And he couldn't ever get there. He just talked about how evil and wicked Russia is, and you can't talk to him, etc. But I mean, those things are incompatible. They can't both exist. What is Trump going to do if he's entering into discussion with him, and how do you think he's going to navigate that relationship?
Well, I think he's going to have to give Mr. Zelensky some tough love. The man is a brilliant actor. He has become a great hero of the Western media, and he's apparently forgotten how to play any other role other than the one that he is playing, which is, I'm indomitable. I will not give up, and I'm eternally optimistic. But his soldiers are deserting. His soldiers are deserting on the front line. People are risking their lives to swim the river to Romania. People who are abroad have absolutely no interest in returning to Ukraine. And so, he's lost touch with reality. There is no prospect that Ukraine, of course he's right in a sense, Ukraine does need to have the strongest possible hand in the future negotiation with Russia. But it can't gain it on the battlefield. It does not have the wherewithal anymore. Where are the soldiers going to come from to carry out to defeat the Russian offensive? They're not there, and Ukraine is falling way short of its recruiting goals. So it's losing huge numbers of people, both to defections and to death on the battlefield. And now, basically, one obvious point that you understand, but maybe people who haven't served in the military don't, is that if you're seriously wounded and you're out of the fight, you might as well be dead in terms of the power that you provide to your government. there are 50,000 amputees at least in Ukraine now. These are people who went to the battlefield, performed bravely, courageously, and they're no longer able to fight. And so, yeah, this is the what Gary has put up is called the fallacy of sunk costs.
Mm.
You know, because we've done a whole lot of stuff. It's cost us a lot of money and blood, and we haven't achieved anything we need. We can't give up. We got to keep going. Even if keeping going is just going to bring more costs up. And yeah, this is an argument for a forever war, which it is. It doesn't have clear or feasible objectives. It never did. And no, the thought Mr. Zelensky asserts that Vladimir Putin or the Russians don't want to end the war. There's no evidence of that. There is a lot of evidence that they do want to end the war. Right. And why shouldn't they? Because they've basically taken almost everything that they set out to take. No, they can now protect the Russian population in Ukraine, either because they've been annexed to Russia or because in the negotiation to come, they will insist on a reinstatement of Minsk and the rules of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which provide that minorities, whether they're Russian-speaking or Hungarian-speaking or Slovak-speaking or Romanian-speaking or whatever they are, have the right to communicate in their language with their local government and to educate their kids in their culture. And so this is going to come out of the negotiations to the extent it hasn't already been achieved on the battlefield.
Yeah, and I want to ask you a question on that in the last amount of time we have here on the negotiations themselves. So when you've talked about this on a number of cases, and I could just add a little bit more on the balance of power between the Ukraine and the Russian side, and that includes the allies on both sides, is irrevocably beneficial to the Russian side. It can never be undone in any kind of a time frame that's generational, anything less than that. So that means that when you talk about Trump and Putin and what's the cards that are in each of their hands for negotiation, it's like Putin's got all the face cards and Trump has some 6s and 7s and maybe a 3 or something like that. Well, very small. So if Trump doesn't concede to the main points that the Russians have, they can simply say, okay, no problem. We'll just keep fighting until they literally conquer everything on their side. What negotiations or what leverage might Trump have to try to at least limit some of that on the other side?
Well, he has taken a position which gives him a hand in this, which is renegotiating the security arrangements in Europe as a whole. I mean, he's proposed a diminished U.S. role in NATO. He has proposed a greater European responsibility for self-defense. This is basically consistent with what the Russians claim they want. Now, we would find out at the negotiating table whether they're sincere or not, but I see no reason to doubt that they are on this. They want an arrangement with Europeans backed by the United States because we are in a position to wreck any agreement that the Europeans make among themselves to end the threat of aggression from their neighbors. And precisely the point that Mr. Trump mentioned, this is flat land. There are no geographical features that divide Russia from Poland and Ukraine and Belarus and Germany. There's nothing between them and the Pyrenees except political understandings, diplomacy. And so there has to be a diplomatic reassurance of Russia. Mr. Trump can provide that. It will be painful, and it will be undoubtedly be attacked by neoconservatives and various special interests. I note that the Atlantic author is the president of some sort of Eastern European American Association. So, you know, there will be opposition, but sometimes in politics, you have to have the courage to act. And we're reminded of that because Jimmy Carter, may rest in peace, showed courage on a whole bunch of issues at Camp David, on the Panama Canal issue. And And, you know, Ronald Reagan showed courage at Reykjavik with Gorbachev. Does Mr. Trump have it in him to do that? He probably
Well,
does.
that's actually one of the things. One of the last questions or things I wanted to pose to you is that when you look at what has at least been reported from the Russian side as their minimum standards that they're willing to discuss, that is the so-called 14 June line that Putin laid out this last summer, where he said all of the annexed territories would have to come to Ukraine. And as you know from looking at a map, there are substantial portions, especially of the 3 southern provinces, that are still under Ukrainian control. Ergo, Trump would have to negotiate away and say, all right, it's not just the line of contact, a freeze there, you know, like a Korea style deal, but you're going to have to withdraw substantial amounts of thousands or hundreds of square kilometers of territory to the west in order for Putin to say, I'm going to stop fighting and we'll end there. How much political capital would Trump have to spend in order to make that concession? Because he'll be just withering fire from this, you know, conservatives.
Well, let's recognize that the border between Ukraine and Russia can only be settled between Ukrainians and Russians. And a sensible negotiation, which I don't think is impossible, would try to put that border along lines that are naturally defensible, which means the Dnieper River in the south. And Mr. Putin said, well, we want all of those oblasts. There would have to be concessions made on the rights of the Russian minority, and to go back to Minsk as part of this package. Look, if there is a negotiation on this, which there should be, and I note that Mr. Trump said he was going to end the war in 24 hours. That was obvious campaign bravado. He's now talking about within some period shorter than 6 months. Some people are talking about Easter. Anyway, we're talking probably about a protracted negotiation during which the fighting will continue, and it will have multiple forums, if you will. The issue of where the Ukraine-Russia border is will have to be negotiated primarily by Ukrainians and Russians. Of course, we and others will be there, if not in the room, at least actively participating at a distance. The question of minority rights is of concern to all Europeans and to the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. And so that will have to be dealt with in that forum. These are not things that are not that difficult. That would mean applying the precedent of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955, which guaranteed rights to minorities in Austria, as it created a neutral Austrian state, which has prospered and been very democratic. And the final issue is, you know, the broad issue of security in Europe. We are participants in that, but so are the Europeans. If the United States is prepared to actually, after 80 years of occupying Germany and with bases all over the place in NATO, if we're really prepared to give Europeans the responsibility, the primary responsibility for defending themselves, and to Europeanize NATO, then, you know, I don't see why we can't have an agreement, but it's going to take time. And you're right, it will be incredibly controversial. It will be destabilizing and jarring, nasty experience for the Europeans who've come to take our presence and our support for granted and can no longer do so. But this is not easy. This is very, very difficult. But that goes back to the question I posed earlier. We have presidents who had the courage to do things. Does Mr. Trump have that courage?
He claims he's a disruptor, and without disruption, you can't undo the status quo. So we'll see how that unfolds in 2025.
That's Chairman Mao's observation. Without destruction, there can be no rebuilding.
Well, we've certainly had a lot of destruction. Let's see if we can get to the rebuilding part.
I agree. Well, there is reason to want to back Mr. Trump in any effort he makes to end this war. Well,
listen, that's some great insights there. We really appreciate you coming on the show today and sharing this. And so I don't know, I actually feel a little more optimistic now than I did at the start of the show. So I appreciate that very much from you.
I'm glad if I had that effect.
Well, so am I, and so are our listeners. We appreciate you guys joining us very much today. By the way, want to let you know at 3:00 today we're going to have a really interesting story. We're going to kind of expand on some of the issues here that Ambassador Freeman mentioned. That really, I'm going to show you pretty conclusively and factually how Biden, NATO, and the West destroyed Ukraine. I know Russia was the instrument that caused a lot of this destruction, but I'm going to lay out some things here in a very logical start to finish exposition, how we were the main reasons why Ukraine has been destroyed. Don't miss this, 3:00 this afternoon, and we'll see you then on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.